Hey everybody, another episode of LaraChat Live, and we have a special guest, Adam Watson. He worked on the Laravel Valet app. So thank you, Adam, for coming on and being here with us. We also have Matt and Riz. One of our usuals, Mike Bonner, couldn't be with us. He had some client deadlines. So I think we can all relate to that. So, Adam, why don't you do a little introduction about yourself and let some of the people know who you are?
Sure. So my name's Adam. I'm a senior developer at a company called Titan Co. If you're, in the Laravel community, you maybe have heard of us, and you've probably heard of Matt Stouffer, who I work with, who does a lot of blogging and stuff like that, and is working on a Laravel book. Um, I've been working with Laravel for several years now as kind of my main framework of choice for most of the client projects that I've worked on. And you might know me from hosting the Full Stack Radio podcast. I blog about Laravel topics and programming related topics quite a bit. And yeah, I've been working on Laravel Valet with Taylor for the last couple weeks now, so I'm excited to talk about that here today.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I've now been following the podcast and all the news, so to be able to talk to you through the video cast and talk about what's coming, it's really exciting. And per our usual format, we talk about the news in the community in the last 2 weeks, and I'm going to hand that over to Riz. He's got some interesting topics to share with the rest of us. Take it away, Riz.
Well, it's been a fun week in PHP. Not just PHP, but servers in general. So, news this week, and I'll keep it fast. First of all, there's a vulnerability in ImageMagick, which is a common media manipulation library that you probably use if you do any sort of cropping or resizing of images on your website. I'll drop the link in chat, or we will tweet it actually from our official Twitter account. And if you are using ImageMagick on your server, you definitely want to patch this one. It's a remote code execution vulnerability, which means very bad things can happen. As far as we know, it affects all versions of ImageMagick on Linux platforms. I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not going to go too deep into it. Feel free to look at the technical information we will tweet out. Or we can go to ImageTragic. That's tragic instead of magic. ImageTragic.com for a layman's explanation of what's going on. So please check it out. This vulnerability is actually very widespread because a lot of servers come with it, but not very many people know about this just yet. In related news, there was a huge bout of drama over alleged statistic manipulation by the new Peach Pixie, I believe is how you pronounce it, framework. The creator is alleged to have used bots actually to manipulate their stats on packages. And in completely unrelated news to that one, suddenly the PHP Framework Interoperability Group, or FIG, is falling apart. Basically, after the drama from the Pixie issue, suddenly there's a lot of noise going on and people arguing and debating about what constitutes somebody to be on the team of the FIG and what they do, and suddenly there was a lot of drama. Catch up with it on Reddit because we're not going to talk about it. But now several big names in the PHP community, including Taylor Otwell of Laravel, and also people from, I believe, Doctrine, Propel, and Guzzle, have also left the Framework Interoperability Group. Now, don't get your pitchforks out too soon. This happens from time to time. And people are already making this alternate group to serve as a community. Because so far, and just so you know, the FIG is the group that does the PSR formats. They do these documents. So if you ever use the auto-loading features from Composer, the standards for that were defined by the FIG. Same goes, they have a logging, I believe, a logging standard and a code standard. So don't change anything about how you work just yet. But it's good to know that things might be changing up soon. Of course, now in Laravel news, Laravel Valet was launched, which is a easy-to-use OS X only native installer to get Laravel going quickly on your Mac. And for that, Go ahead, Sean. You want to start talking about it?
Yeah, so I've taken a look at this documentation. I actually have not had the chance to use it. For myself, I'm a huge fan of Vagrant because I love the ability to have a what feels like a simulated server environment where it almost feels as if I am logging into a server. I can run all of my regular server commands, but I understand where there might be a need for this because it's a lightweight version where for someone who doesn't need all of the server operation, just wants to get in and start coding, because there is sometimes a separation between the DevOps layer and the software development layer. So some of the things with Valet, I'd love to invite Adam to tell us a little bit about it in his words, and go ahead, Adam.
Sure. So Valet kind of came about because Taylor was working on updating Homestead for Ubuntu 16.04, the latest LTS that just came out. And in trying to do that, he was running into a bug with Vagrant that I guess wouldn't let him do what he needed to do. So in talking about it with him, I just mentioned that most of the time I'm still working on a local install of PHP on my Mac, even for client projects, and just using like the built-in artisan serve command most of the time, and just a local installation of my SQL or SQLite or Postgres or whatever database I happen to be using. And so he started playing around with it just to kind of see what the experience was like, and I guess he realized that it wasn't really as scary as it kind of seems at first. Like, people are kind of worried that it's going to really like add a lot of cruft to their system, stuff that's kind of hard to keep working or hard to uninstall if you don't want it there, and stuff like that. Or if you need external dependencies, how do you get those installed and stuff like that. But I've always kind of used the built-in PHP server just because I always found Vagrant to be kind of slow. Anytime I used Vagrant, I would be getting like 300 to 700 millisecond response times on most of the endpoints that I would hit, which isn't too bad, but it is definitely slower than what you're used to browsing around on the internet. And I would try things like using NFS shared folders and stuff to speed that up, but sometimes I would run into bugs with NFS shared folders where shared folders wouldn't update properly, or you'd run into weird like send file related bugs and stuff like that. So for me, working at an agency like I do at Titan, I work on a lot of different projects all the time, so I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between stuff frequently. So it's nice to be able to just kind of spin something up quickly on the command line instead of having to make sure my VM is set up and make sure I got my hosts file updated. And there's just all these kind of little small things that add up and make it kind of a slower getting started experience versus being able to just run one command on the command line and get running. So me and Taylor were kind of playing with that, and I mentioned to him that kind of the only thing about it that wasn't really that great was that it was kind of hard to maintain kind of multiple projects at the same time. So if you're used to working with Homestead, you might have, and you have multiple projects that you work on constantly. Like, for example, Taylor is always working on Forge and Envoyer and Spark demo projects and stuff. He is always switching back and forth between them. So he has them set up in his hosts file on his .dev domains, and he can just visit them in the browser whenever he wants and work on them at any given time. And that workflow is a little bit harder if you're using the PHP built-in server, because you'd have to open that project on the command line and spin up the server for each one independently anytime that you needed it. And you'd be hitting like localhost 8000 in the browser every time. So there was that little bit of like getting started flow there that was a little bit of a pain if you're used to jumping back and forth between multiple projects like that. So I'd mentioned that that was kind of the only thing that bugged me about it. And then we just got to kind of Googling around to see if there was a way to kind of resolve that problem. And we noticed this tool that Basecamp released in the Rails community years and years ago called POW. And POW is like a local Rails kind of development environment that lets you just hit any of your projects in the browser after symlinking those projects to a specific folder. And it uses, they have a custom DNS server that they wrote, and I think it's a node-based tool for resolving these DNS entries. And they create this file called Etsy Resolver, and then they use .dev as well for most of their stuff. And you put that in this Etsy Resolver folder on your Mac, and that tells your Mac anytime that you hit this certain top-level domain to look for a DNS server that's running on whatever specific IP or port that you specify. So when we saw what was possible with this, we realized that you could use a local server and not have to specify the port in the URL if you were able to get the server to run on port 80. And using this Etsy resolver thing, you could just have things automatically resolve to the correct DNS server and start to be able to do some really cool stuff. And we figured out that the way we set up Valet, we were able to kind of create this environment where if you tell Valet about the folder that all your projects live in, and you make sure that you give your projects names that are only like valid URL characters, you know what I mean? So try to avoid spaces and stuff like that in your project names. Then you can just hit the browser and go to whatever your project name is, .dev, and you just have access to that project right away. You never have to do anything. So it was pretty cool to be able to just like create a new Laravel app on the fly, and it's already available in your browser. You never have to set up a single thing once you kind of have the initial configuration set up. And it felt kind of magical, and it was pretty exciting. And after doing a little bit of tweaking, we were able to get it, using the PHP 7 op cache and stuff to the point where it can serve, that homepage of a base Laravel application in under 10 milliseconds, which is pretty awesome compared to, sometimes the 500 millisecond responses that you get working with Vagrant. So that's kind of the, I guess, long-winded overview of kind of where the project came from and kind of why we're excited about it. But I'd be happy to talk about any specifics or anything that anyone is interested in hearing more about.
Yeah, absolutely. Only developers would complain between 10 milliseconds and 500 milliseconds, right? Only us. It was interesting you mentioned send file, because I actually, that particular, I don't know, bug or setting, whatever you want to call it, it delayed me for like, I don't know, I forget, I think it might have been 1 or 2 days just trying to figure out what is going on. And boy, that frustrated me. But, when I found out the solution, I was over the moon. So yeah, I can definitely based on your explanation, I can definitely start to see the performance improvements. And so one of the things that my question for you is, do you think with having Homestead, other Vagrant boxes that other people could spin up, and then Valet, do you think it's going to get a bit confusing for people to come on board and be able to consume these services? The way I'm thinking for someone like myself, I prefer the Vagrant route because I have power over my box and I can install whatever I want, do what I need, versus someone who may be a bit new and just wants to spin up a website. I'll go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's no intention for Valet to be like a Homestead replacement necessarily. It kind of just was born out of, there's still a lot of people out there who still use the PHP server anyways, right? So people like myself who, despite having Homestead available and no Valet available, I still chose to run PHP locally most of the time, just because it fit kind of better with, my workflow and just kind of the trade-offs that matter to me. So I care more about things being quick and it not having to like SSH into my virtual machine to run my migrations. Little things like that like bother me more than worrying about, okay, so I have to install MySQL on my Mac. Some people really don't like having to do that. So I think a lot of it just comes down to like a personal preference thing, kind of like you're saying. It's totally 100% valid to prefer to use a virtual machine, and those arguments are totally great arguments. And if you're someone who values the benefits that you get from a virtual machine more than the benefits of what you get from working locally, then that's a great option for you. So I think we're in a pretty good spot by being able to have both, honestly, because to this point we didn't really have a great story for people who wanted to develop locally aside from just like running artisan serve. And while that was pretty good, we've realized that there was a lot of things that we could do to make that experience even better. The other thing with Homestead is that currently Valet is a Mac only thing, right? So if you're developing on Windows, it's almost a necessity to be working in a virtual machine because just the chances of running into difficult to debug issues and getting things working, it's just a lot harder to get that working locally on a Windows machine than it is on like a Unix-based operating system like OS 10 or Linux. And if you're on Ubuntu, any Linux machine, then you're going to you could set that whole machine up to work exactly like Homestead works if you want to, or you can use a virtual machine there too, and Homestead supports that out of the box. So definitely that's still a good option for Windows developers and people who want to use a VM in Linux and on Mac. But if you're on Mac, then currently you have the option to kind of choose between both and hopefully have a really great development experience in either situation, depending on kind of what fits your personality and personal preferences better. So.
Personality and preferences aside, do you think it's a tool for more for, I guess, newbie developers against more senior developers, experienced developers? Which one do you think would get the most benefit from Laravel Valet?
I think, I don't know if I would slice it like based on necessarily experience. I think it kind of depends a lot on the project. So if you're working on a project that really heavily depends on, a lot of other services, like maybe you need to have Elasticsearch running, or you want to have Redis running, or any of these other things, and that can start to really feel like a lot of stuff to install locally and maintain. And the biggest issue with running stuff locally is just it's not as disposable as a virtual machine, right? The beauty of Homestead is if for some reason you screw up your virtual machine or corrupt something or mess up some setting, it's really easy to just delete it and just spin up a fresh one and like be good to go from scratch again. Whereas that's kind of a harder thing to maintain on your local machine if you have kind of a complex set of dependencies that you're working on. But honestly, I think if you're just using like PHP and a database, which a lot of simple projects can work fine with just that setup, then I don't find it to be that big of a benefit to be working in a virtual machine environment versus something like Valet. So, I mean, I do professional development work for clients all day long, just working locally on my Mac, unless I need to use a virtual machine. And honestly, I find most of the times that I do need to use a virtual machine, it's not Homestead that I'm using, but rather some custom virtual machine that we've had to build specifically for that project based on the dependencies of that project. So, I mean, I kind of jump back and forth between both, but if I'm working on something that I can run on my Mac without, worrying about having to install a lot of extra stuff, then I definitely prefer to do that. I think you're right that it can help people get started faster too. So I have a friend who he's a designer and he's learning how to program and wants to learn how to kind of put together, simple applications and kind of work his way into the back end and become better at programming. And I tried to help him get set up with Homestead from scratch on his machine once, and I expected it to be really simple, and it was fairly simple for me because I know kind of all the terminology, I kind of know what everything does. It still took us about an hour to get everything kind of working, get VirtualBox installed, get the machine pulled down and provisioned, and set up his hosts file and tweak a couple things here and there until it was working. But it was a real complex setup for him to be able to kind of adjust as he needed to, because he doesn't really know anything about virtual machines or Vagrant, or barely even knows how to work with the terminal. The other day he wanted to get back into it after he had saw that we had announced the Valet stuff. So I hopped on a Screen Hero call with him, and we got Valet set up on his machine and had him serving applications in his browser in under 10 minutes. And now if he ever wants to start a new app, he just has to drop that folder into his sites folder, and it's just going to work. And for someone like him he's not concerned at all about having to deal with Redis or Elasticsearch or anything like that. So that setup's going to work real great for him as kind of a learning platform to be able to prototype ideas and play with different things and not have to worry about the complexity of understanding exactly how the virtualization setup is working, and knowing that Vagrant might shut down once in a while, and you might have to restart Vagrant if your battery gets below 5%, or little things like that. It's also really good if you're on a less powerful machine, right? So if you're on a MacBook Air or something that only has 4 gigs of RAM, using a virtual machine was kind of it's kind of like it felt kind of crappy to have to do. It's like, oh, I have to give up like half the resources on my entire machine just to be able to run one site. It'd be nice if I could just use something lighter that only used the absolute minimum resources that it needed. And so I think it's a really good option for people in those situations too. So
It's a pretty interesting point you made about your friend there, because I also am teaching a good friend of mine who is a pretty strong programmer, but he was using I think it was WAMP or MAMP, one of those GUI software systems or whatever they are. And I was trying to teach him Homestead, and it was almost a foreign concept in some ways. It took a lot of extra time to explain, like you said, spinning up the Vagrant box, SSHing in, setting up your host file. There's a lot of different steps, whereas if I was able to use Vagrant with him, I'm sure we could have gotten fun up that night and started doing some coding. So it was only, what, 2 days ago that we actually started coding, so it took some extra time, but that's really interesting. That's a good thing to think about. I know that Matt's been dying to ask some questions, so you can see him laughing there. So I'll pass it over to Matt. Go ahead.
Yeah, so not so much direct questions, but the one thing I thought was probably my all-time favorite feature in Valet and I meant, like, I haven't dug into it too deep because I went in a totally different direction and made some stuff for Homestead to make that a little smoother for myself. But one thing I did think was awesome is the ability to share the links. So you can actually send the link out to your customer. So, I mean, because I've had to deal with so many occurrences where you end up with these disastrous demos where you've just pushed it to a new space or something, you're setting it up for the client to come in and be all like, ooh, and it's like, oh, it worked on my laptop, no, and you're freaking out, right? So my biggest thing was, like, Adam, where did you guys get the idea that, like, to put that in there? I mean, that to me is like the golden crown on that.
Just double checking quickly. Can you guys still hear me? I had to switch some audio stuff around. Okay. Yeah, so that was actually Taylor's idea. So Valet doesn't really have to do anything. There's not a lot of code in Valet for doing that, right? That's all kind of powered by ngrok, which is a tool and service for doing this that I had actually never used until Taylor thought it would be a cool thing to add to Valet. And Valet just kind of gives you, like, a little bit of sugar on top of it to kind of let you do it real fast from within whatever directory that you're in. And honestly, I'm pretty sure it would be pretty easy to use ngrok even with Homestead if you wanted to as well. Obviously, it'd be slower. But yeah, I don't know. That was Taylor's idea. He kind of lands on kind of these exciting ideas for little things like that a lot of the time, and even just like the probably the coolest thing about that feature that probably no one even really notices, that was actually surprisingly a lot of work to pull off properly, was that once you run Valet Share, the URL is in your clipboard instantly, and you can just paste that into the browser and you're done. You probably wouldn't even notice that was there if no one told you. Like, you might do it, but you don't really appreciate, like, the kind of thought that goes into making something like that easy, because it was a pain to just run Valet Share and then have to, like, select the URL in the terminal and then paste it into the browser. So yeah, that's a couple little nice things like that over top of it. But yeah, it's definitely a cool feature. The other cool thing about that too is it makes it a lot easier to test things like webhooks and stuff locally on your machine. So because you now have a public URL into your development environment, if you're working with some external service, like maybe you're working on an app that receives webhooks from GitHub or something like that, doing normal local development, there's no real way to test that. You'd normally have to push that to a staging server or set up something like ngrok yourself. But now it's really easy to just, like, share that site and add that URL to your configuration in whatever service that you want to be able to receive webhooks from, and now you have a public URL that they can send that data to. So it kind of completes that story a little bit in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's definitely a cool feature, and I'm interested to see what sort of interesting things people are able to do with that and what sort of problems it solves for people.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as I started looking into the fact that was actually using ngrok, I went all crazy, and I'm getting a whole thing set up to work with actually Homestead and ngrok directly then, so you can run the whole sequence through the, just without Valet, no offense. And I know Riz has got a few questions or next steps to talk about, and so I'm going to pass it over to Riz. So
I just want to preface real quick, Adam. Just so you know, most of our questions are from our community. We have a lot of people asking about Valet, which is why I think it's an interesting tool, because it's made to make things easier, but at the same time, it's not exactly aimed at a complete newbie, right? Because you still need to install things on your own, right? So we've been talking to other people on Slack. People like, I'm trying to install Valet, I'm trying it out, but I don't understand how to do so and so. And To your point earlier about your designer, about any sort of designer friends or anybody just getting into programming, trying to understand the ropes, we all know that the terminal is probably one of the scariest things for them, right? I hate to ask you this, but it's a question we've been getting way too many times. Do you think there is room for a GUI-based, like we know right now that WAMP and MAMP are probably the most common development environments, simply because they're easy. You download one file, you press one button, it's on, right?
Yeah.
And people are like, can we have that with Valet? Like, we want a Laravel interface, but a lot of people look at the Valet instructions and they look at the first steps, and it's already saying stuff like install Composer, and they're like, what is Composer and how do I install it? Do you think there's room for that? Go ahead.
I think it's definitely something that Taylor and I have talked about. I mean, just the overall goal in general of trying to make the setup process as seamless as possible. So I think this is actually pushed. It's not tagged, and it might not even. It's not documented or anything for sure. But we've been playing around with like some other installation options. So, when you install Homebrew, you just do it on the command line by like typing this curl command and piping that into Bash, and it just kind of does everything for you. We kind of were able to prototype a similar setup with Valet that I ran on my fiance's laptop, and she's not a developer, so her machine, doesn't have any development stuff set up on it at all. And she was actually running Mountain Lion until yesterday. So I upgraded to the latest version of OS 10, El Capitan on there, so it was like a fresh installation of a fresh OS 10 install. I ran this one curl command that Taylor and I put together, and it automatically downloaded the Xcode tools for me. It downloaded Homebrew for me. It downloaded Composer. It installed everything. There's a couple prompts that happen that you kind of have to watch, but it's just paste one thing into your terminal and then don't worry about it. And there's a couple hiccups and stuff in there along the way that we'd like to iron out, but we're definitely exploring ways to make it easier and try to remove kind of any of the intimidation factor that is kind of there from working on the terminal. And, working, it's kind of just a layer over Homebrew is kind of how the whole thing works, right? And Homebrew is kind of an intimidating tool in general if you're not comfortable with it. Even up until we kind of got deep into the Valet stuff, I didn't really understand a lot of the features that Homebrew had. But now I feel like very confident in it because I kind of understand it more, and I feel like I know how to make it do what I want. I know what it means to link and unlink things and, whatever. So I've been trying to work pretty hard myself personally with anyone who's run into issues with it. I was on Screen Hero for 45 minutes yesterday with someone who had just mentioned, on a GitHub issue that they couldn't get it running. And we walked through every possible thing I could think of and eventually got it sorted out for them. But we've been taking notes of like every single error we ever run to, and we're trying to make it as easy as possible and as kind of bulletproof as possible too. So, of course, everyone has a different setup. Some people have multiple drives, which puts their home folder in a different place than we were expecting. Things like that. Sometimes people have other services installed on their computer that are hijacking the port that DNS mask wants to run on, and that's a really, really hard issue to notice because you don't get any good error information. So we're playing around with the idea of adding a command that's kind of like the brew doctor command, but for Valet that can basically say it can basically detect if everything's working properly, and if something's not working properly, it can go through the steps to kind of try and check everything that we would normally troubleshoot, but do it in an automated way. And it can say things like, hey, we noticed there's this Python process that's running on port 53 that shouldn't be there, and that's preventing DNS mask from running. I'm just trying to make it as pleasant of an experience as possible. We haven't gone down the path of any user interface ideas or anything like that, but we have talked about it a lot, and we'll just have to see where it goes. We're still real early, and it's still changing rapidly and stuff like that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities to do interesting things with it in that kind of space. So we'll see where it goes.
I think that's the holy grail, honestly. Because if you're onboarding an old developer, say a WordPress developer, and they want to get into Laravel or something, and some other PHP framework nowadays, you either have to deal with an inconsistent environment to install it natively, or you have to walk them through installing Vagrant, which is either really smooth or really bad, or you have to walk them through I guess using WAMP or MAMP. So I think if that definitely is the holy grail. Having that easy installer, you run a command, you have the development environment, it's ready, doesn't have the drawbacks of using Vagrant. You don't need VirtualBox, you don't need 4 GB of RAM for the box, and I think that's not only big for Laravel, it's big for the entire PHP community.
Yeah, there's.
Letting us. Go ahead.
I was going to say, kind of like the real true golden feature of Valet that I don't know that a lot of people truly get, like understand that this is possible, but Taylor added this functionality like last Wednesday night. Around the same time I was working on that silly video that I was making. And it was this driver concept. So the way that Valet works under the hood is every single request is proxied through, like, if you've worked with the built-in PHP server, you can have these router scripts, right? So when you start the PHP server, it routes everything through this one PHP file, and that PHP file can tell, it returns false if something's a static file, so it knows to serve it directly. Otherwise, it returns the path to the PHP file that it should run based on what the URL is. So we basically have a router script that sits in front of every single request that hits Valet, and it basically is simulating like Nginx rewrite rules or htaccess rules. That's kind of like the job of this thing. But the magic part about it is that it is kind of extended by all these different drivers. So what it does is anytime you have a request come in, we detect what folder that request should be going to based on the domain name, because the domain name matches your project name. And then we spin through this list of drivers and we ask each driver, given the path to this folder, are you the driver that should be responsible for serving this folder? And each driver has kind of its own custom logic to detect if it should be the right driver. For example, the Laravel driver checks for the presence of a couple files, including like the artisan CLI file, and any kind of like basically fingerprints that it can use to tell, like, okay, this is a Laravel project. And if it can tell that it's a Laravel project, it tells the Valet router basically, hey, yeah, I'm the right driver for this. Proxy all the requests to me, and I'll make sure that they go to the right files. So we have drivers for like every major PHP project already. There's a Joomla driver, a Drupal driver, a WordPress driver, a Statamic driver, a Craft CMS driver. Like, there's dozens that are in there already. So you can actually do a fresh WordPress. You can download WordPress as a zip file, unzip WordPress in your projects folder, rename the folder to something like My WordPress Site, and go to mywordpresssite.dev in the browser, and your WordPress installation is working. Like, you don't have to do anything. It automatically detects what the project type is and sets up the appropriate rewrite rules for that project. So it's actually even easier and more magical than MAMP in a lot of ways. And that's kind of the thing that I think Taylor and I are both most excited about. Is like, it's seriously insane. Like, I remember when me and Taylor were demoing it, he was like, okay, let's just sit back for a minute and appreciate for a second what I'm about to be able to do in the browser. Unzip WordPress, go to the site, WordPress is working. Create a new Symfony project, Symfony is working. Create a new Laravel project, Laravel's working. Zero configuration. It just like detects it automatically. No, there's no driver for PHPixie project. But you know what? The thing is, a lot of these things don't even need custom drivers. So there's a lot of PHP projects out there that are kind of designed to be able to easily run on shared hosts and stuff like that. And a lot of them kind of use a similar approach. They all have very similar htaccess rules. Like, they usually have like a front controller and like a public index PHP sort of thing. So we fall back to this one driver for anything that we can't detect as a specific project type. And for any PHP project that is kind of designed to be as drop-in as possible on like a typical Apache style setup, most of these things just work. So like, for example, ZenCart, which is like a pretty common e-commerce project, I didn't have to do anything to get that to work. It just kind of worked. And there's a lot of other ones that work that way too. Even WordPress, honestly, except for a couple specific rules, basically works with just the fallback driver. But we detect it specially just because it opens up the doors for things down the road that we haven't really figured out what they're going to be. But it's kind of nice to know, oh, this is a WordPress site. Maybe there's WordPress specific things that we can do to help people in that space. So, even though it's Laravel Valet, like, you can literally use it to basically automatically run basically any PHP project in existence that uses any sort of common rewrite rules, as long as it's not something totally custom and one-off that we have no way of knowing about. But if you're using like any of the popular projects, you can basically just drag and drop and visit it in the browser, and it works automatically. So it's pretty cool.
That is interesting. I'll be honest. I'm one of those detractors from having any kind of development environment not like my production environment. So I'm usually very fussy about using a VirtualBox machine for this. But that actually opens up a lot of room, especially for tinkering projects, I guess, when you just want to try something out quickly, want to prototype something. I saw Matt laughing a little bit over there because we talked about this too the other day about how you really want to have dedicated environments, but if you can really reduce the friction for making the smaller or simpler testing stuff easier, and especially make it easier for new people just getting into this, because I still think the biggest problem with frameworks like Laravel is the friction. Getting into Laravel requires you to figure out how to use the terminal, install a whole bunch of things. People don't even know what half of this stuff is. What is Composer? So having a single path to getting it running quickly, without having to wrangle around Vagrant and give up halfway 3 hours in, is amazing. We really appreciate you, Adam. That's fascinating, and I'm going to have to keep tabs on this. And I'm sure the community is very excited. There's a lot of interesting stuff to learn. Is there anything you want to tell our community at large? Because they are asking a lot of Valet questions. Anything you want to tell them before we move on?
I don't know. I don't think I have any specific exciting Valet things to share that we haven't already talked about. I would say that try it out, and if you run into problems, post them on GitHub, because we're really dedicated to trying to make the installation experience as smooth as possible. I definitely have no interest in just kind of like shrugging anyone off who can't get it set up, regardless of the reason, even if it's purely their own fault. I would like to know what it is, so we can figure out how to make it smoother and try and make it as easy as possible for people to get running with it, because otherwise the project isn't really delivering on kind of the promises that it makes. So it's not bulletproof yet, and there's things that we're always looking to improve, but we're trying really hard to make it as easy of an experience as possible, even to the point where like we have this layer, this like bash layer that sits in front of the actual Valet kind of command, and the only reason it really exists at this point is because we don't want people to have to remember which commands they need to run as root and which ones they don't need to run as root. So, for example, there's a lot of commands like valet install, which needs to do things that require writing to some DNS mask configuration files and stuff that are owned by root. So you normally have to do sudo valet install or sudo valet restart, but some things you don't want to do with sudo because it's going to write files and directories as root then that you don't want to run as root. So it can be like confusing to remember which one you're supposed to use. So there's this layer that sits in front where we kind of store all the logic for whether a command needs to be root or not, and you just run everything without root, and if it needs root privileges, it'll prompt you for a password. So just like little details like that we're really trying to perfect and make sure that the goal is to try and make it impossible for you to screw up your machine, basically, because I think that's everyone's fear when it comes to trying to set up a local development environment. So if we can make it as easy as MAMP and like twice as powerful as MAMP and faster than MAMP and leverage all the power of Homebrew, which I think is one of the other big advantages we have over those tools, is like if you're using MAMP or WAMP or any of these other things and a new PHP version comes out, who knows when you're going to be able to use it. You have to wait for them to decide to bundle it with like the next version and release it to you. Since we build everything on top of Homebrew, as soon as it's available in one of those Homebrew kegs, you can just pull it in. And that happens really, really, really fast, like within a day or two at most of when a new version is out there. So it's cool to be able to kind of build on top of existing powerful tools like that and just kind of try and be able to provide a more intuitive interface to people so they can really leverage the power of those things and get all the benefits of that stuff without kind of the fear that comes along with it sometimes. So if anyone's playing with it or runs into issues, definitely let me know. I see someone in the chat is having trouble installing it because they're on Windows. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do to help you there. But keep following the project and let me know any issues that you run into and any ideas that you have for how we can make the experience better for people, because we're really dedicated to making it as good as it can be. So.
Thanks a ton. I bet you'll have a lot more activity now that I'm going to start telling people if you're having issues, just go to GitHub. It should fix everything. All right, so let's move on to our second topic, probably a quick one. But it's the one which I think developers in general want to talk about a little bit more, which is about change logs and the fact that a lot of packages and projects don't properly track their changes. Of course, this is probably a bigger deal when it comes to packages because when people upgrade from one version to another, they want to know what changed, especially if they need to tweak any classes and the interface has changed. And a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people think that just the Git logs are often enough information to tell what changed, although, of course, a lot of people don't know how to traverse the Git logs or even how to access Git, because some people just download your packages from Composer and just don't even think about how to upgrade, or they'll just type Composer update and suddenly everything's changed. We're not going to talk about semantic versioning today. That's a big debate for another day. So we're just going to focus on history tracking and change logs for now. So let's just start going around. Matt, what do you think? Are they actually necessary? Are Git logs enough?
I'm going to start off by saying Git logs are not enough, in my opinion. Mostly because, and there's a couple primary reasons for this. So first reason is dealing with legacy. You jump into a legacy project and you want a quick snapshot of how that legacy project has grown, even in the last month. Actually being able to look at a changelog and see the summarized components of how things have gone, awesome. For microservice development, if you're building little microservice apps in a bigger structure, that makes it incredibly easy to follow where guys were going and everything else. I mean, sometimes it's like, oh, we converted everything to Guzzle 6, and now there was changes across the board, and you can easily see the direction the group was going. The next reason, and then the next part is for packages. I mean, again, like you're putting out a package to the community, and it's nice to be able to see, again, a summarized version of things. Like the biggest problem I have with the Git commits is, I mean, like I'm brutal for like minor changes. That'll be the whole comment, and it's like, well, that doesn't tell anybody anything. But yeah, so I'm very pro change.
That's good to know, because you write packages and basic foundational packages for people who use Laravel, and for them, they love when you have new features. They love when there's new stuff for them to play with. So I've actually heard people appreciate the fact that you update on Slack every time there's something new on one of your packages, because that means they can go over and take a look at what else to check out. So now that you have your change logs, then you have to decide who makes them. And this is a big point of contention, because I've been in companies where the QA guys say, well, the developers are writing the code. And then the developers say, well, the project manager is the guy managing which features are implemented. And then the QA guys are saying, the project managers are saying, well, the guys who actually know the actual features are the QA guys. So, Sean, if you don't mind, who do you think should actually make them?
A good question. I don't have a quick answer. I've been in bigger companies where the QA team or a development manager of sorts will manage that kind of process. And thinking back quite a few years when I last worked at a larger company, I don't think we really did change logs in a very efficient manner. I think we basically just wrote down the ticket numbers and that was it. So any new developer coming on board would just have to look at the ticket numbers, figure out what was done. We didn't even do a pull request, a whole get flow workflow. And it wasn't until the last couple of years when I started working in smaller startups and building these companies from the ground up that we started adopting some of these processes. And even at that point, it was much easier to, let's say we were using Jira. It was so much easier to just run a sprint, take the report at the end of the sprint, and share that as your change log. And it was, in my opinion, it was kind of the lazy way. It was efficient because I was able to show the stakeholders, look, our burn down chart is here. Our tickets, all these tickets, we got 50 tickets closed. That's a number that mattered to them. But if they see a big bulleted list, this is what we changed, the stakeholders, it doesn't tell them very much. So in my opinion, it really depends on who your audience is. You got a small development team and you have the time to do it, I think it's great. If you have a technical leader or stakeholder in your company, even better. But if you don't have those technical people, sometimes you have to come up with solutions that help them understand what is going on in the project. And it's all about communicating to your audience. Who is your audience? Technical, non-technical? So that's kind of where I lie. I actually want to hear your guys' opinion. I would love to have this discussion continue in the community. I want to learn more about it. So I pass it back to you guys. Like, teach me something I don't know.
I think an important point of that, though, is, and this is something I've personally run up against before, is if, for example, the project manager does it and the changelog is in the Git repo, suddenly the project manager needs to know how to use Git. We know how that goes usually, if they're not technically minded, or if the QA guy doesn't know how to use Git, they need to add changelogs to the repo, and it's a text file, and I guess it's relatively easy to just add a few more lines and modify, but still it's a learning process, and some people don't think they can justify the added time, although it's just a few lines. You still need to think, right? What happened this week? What did we change? What's new in this release? What happened in the log so far? It does take a couple hours to update a changelog or so, maybe. Adam, if you don't mind if I ask you, how much do you think should be in the changelogs? If it's technically minded, do you think it only needs to cover, say, interface changes? Does it need to cover new classes? How far should new features be discussed in changelogs, or should those be in docs instead? What do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to say, I guess. I've never really worried about things like documenting, new classes and stuff that were added. I guess I've always thought about them more from either new features that people can use that are maybe consuming your library, if it's a library, or if it's a just a general project that you're working on for your team to be able to maintain, then just kind of new things that were added, as well as breaking changes. I think are really important to document, and any bug fixes. So if someone has run into a bug and they're working on a specific version of your library, it's easy for them to find out where they need to switch to solve that problem. I think something that is worth mentioning regarding the changelog thing, especially in the open source world, is I have several open source packages that a number of people use and I have to maintain, and I'm not that good about keeping track of changes. Like, the most I usually will end up doing is just documenting stuff whenever I tag a new release, just kind of making notes of whatever was changed there. And even that's hard to keep track of sometimes. But if you're someone who's just looking to get into open source and trying to find an area to contribute, I think trying to help projects improve their changelogs and release notes and stuff like that is a great way to get involved without necessarily having to feel like you have to somehow have some brilliant idea for some new feature or fixing critical security bugs or whatever. And open source maintainers will really appreciate that stuff. I think the hardest part of maintaining an open source project is documentation and change logs and release notes and stuff like that. It's hard to have the energy for that stuff after you've gone through and done all the work to actually get the thing to work properly. And when all that stuff is in your head and everything about it, and you've been talking to any of the contributors and issues and stuff like that, sometimes it's easy to forget how important that is for people who haven't been following every line of code that you've been writing for the thing as you go along. So if you're someone who's looking to contribute, definitely look for opportunities to improve things like documentation and keeping track of when features were introduced and things and change logs and stuff like that.
And the best part of contributing documentation is you can't break any code. Just make edits and you can't really break anything. All right, Matt, back to you for a sec. So you've worked with legacy code, right? So I assume you've dealt with handling how old broken code bases have to transition into new ones. How did you manage tracking the history on these projects?
Well, for the most part, it has yet to be a real successful occurrence of this. Now, there was a link somebody posted not that long ago showing a great breakdown for changelogs, and personally, I found it to be great. Like, it was a really nice structure to them using Markdown for it, and version, date, blah blah blah. I'm sure one of us is going to find that and post that link in a minute. And I was inspired by that simplicity, so then I made a little command line app so that you can simply jump in while you're in your project. You can just say, changelog make, and then, or changelog create, and then changelog add, and then you define with the options whether or not you added something, and just type a sentence, comma separated, so you can say what you added, changed, fixed, removed, just those basic components. And the whole intention was to make it really easy for you to just roll with, and it'll auto tag the whole repo for you at the same time. So presuming you've done all your commits, you can run in, make this command in the changelog, and you're good to go. And then, and so the whole purpose of making that was to make it easier for people on our team to start doing better changelog records for all the transitions that are happening right now. Because we mostly build microservice structures, so it's easier to track the differences that happen, right? It's not like big Mondo apps in that sense.
Is that notification from Slack? Oh yeah, Slack people. Matt, you gonna discuss more about your latest project? The tool, the mystery tool.
Oh, the tool, like the actual little command line thing?
Do you want to get into it more, or do you think that's a topic for another day?
Well, the changelog one's really simple. You just do global composer install to get it. We'll share the link in a moment, but I mean, you can just run that, and it's like, it's CLG. I'm not gonna get into that, specifics. You can see that on GitHub. But yeah, it just makes it really easy to maintain your change logs. And in terms of HomeForge, I'm not going to talk about HomeForge yet. That's my own. Well, it's out there. If you see it, play with it. Whatever.
Seems like you have announcements coming up soon, but okay, let's leave it at that. Yeah, the changelog tool, I actually hinted at this on Front Porch yesterday. It's basically just a quick command which appends to your changelog file rapidly, so you don't have to actually edit the file. And you can probably fold that straight into your workflow when you're, probably right before you make a git commit or before you merge in your feature bench. Well, all right then, we're running short on time, so Sean, I'll pass it back to you, and anything up for today?
No, I think we will step into our community Q&A in our own Q&A on this show. So this question is for Adam, our special guest. What are your favorite projects that you're working on at this moment, maybe aside from Laravel Valet?
Sure. So, I mean, the thing that is actually sucking up all my time lately is trying to finish this this book that I've been working on. So I've been working on a book called Refactoring to Collections about using Laravel's collection package and just kind of functional programming ideas in general to kind of simplify procedural code. So I got the book finished, written. All the content is ready, but I'm just working on some screencasts that are going to be bundled with it. So if anyone is interested in learning more about that, they can find out about it at adamwathan.me/refactoring-to-collections. But other than that, Valet has been kind of keeping me really busy for the last couple of weeks, and just client work and stuff during the day. I also have a SaaS application called Nitpick CI, which is a tool for automating PSR2 kind of style checking on GitHub pull requests. So check that out if you're interested. It's free for open source stuff. So that kind of sucks up a little bit of my time in the evenings as well. But yeah, the book and the Valet stuff is what's been taking up most of my time for sure.
That's pretty cool. I don't think we have any other questions. We checked the community, and I think your description of Valet was so concise that everybody just they're not even watching anymore. They've gone and started installing and started playing with things. So with that being said, I would like to extend a thank you, Adam, for coming on the show and giving us an hour of your time to talk about Valet, among other topics. And of course, our regulars, Matt and Riz, for coming on. And of course, also throw out a thank you to Matt Hatcher, our social media, Twitter tweeting guy, helping us with the questions all behind the scenes. And of course, our community for watching and checking in. And of course, this chat will be available on YouTube for you to watch. You don't have to watch it live. You can catch up later. And we do have some exciting news with regard to, how do I say it, giveaways for the community. And we already gave away some dialci.com coupons. Check our Twitter feed for that. There's going to be some other ones coming. I'm not going to release them today, but if we get our Twitter follower count up higher, then we'll start sharing some of our goodness. So we'll talk about that probably in the next show, and keep an eye on our Twitter and the Slack chat. We'll make announcements here and there. So again, thank you to everybody who came on, and I hope you guys enjoyed the show. See you guys.
Yeah, thank you. It's fun coming on. See ya.